If your painting is drying too fast, try this one surprising tip. So I have my watercolor paper here, 300 grams, on top of some glass. You can use Perspex. I'm also using my framing tape here to tilt the glass. What you want to do is wet the back of the watercolor paper to begin with a large soft head brush. Really take your time wetting it, allowing the water to really soak through the paper, as you can see I'm doing here, making sure there's no dry spots. And as you can see, the paper's really cockling and warping now as well, and it's actually stretching the paper, so it's quite a nice way of actually painting on a flat surface as well. So I'm really spending time wetting this paper, plenty of water. And what I'm going to do is wet the glass as well, make sure there's lots of liquid here so it enables the water to soak again through the paper. I'm placing the paper now wet side down, and I'm going to start painting the actual front of the paper here, the right way up. Sometimes it's difficult to tell, so don't worry in this instance. But if you're removing it from a pad or something like that, just make a little note or mark in the bottom corner so you know which one's the right way. So I'm wetting the top side now and just taking my time, really soaking this paper. And I'm just mopping up all the sort of excess water around the edge here so it doesn't creep back into my painting later with my paper towel. So I've got a watercolor pencil here. You can use any color. I'm using a sort of reddy sort of color here, and I am sort of drawing onto the damp surface. And what's quite nice about using a watercolor pencil is it kind of dissolves later in your painting, so you don't have any pencil marks. So I'm actually just drawing some very simple lines here to outline the water and also the distant trees and horizon. I'm mixing up some raw sienna here. You can use yellow ochre and also some cadmium yellow. You could use lemon yellow. And I'm painting wet on wet the yellow to begin with, and then a little bit of the raw sienna at the top, right in the centre of the sky with my size 8 brush. I'm mixing up some Pyrrole orange now. You could use red and yellow mixed together. I'm painting this wet into wet again with the size 8 brush, and I've just diluted the brush there just to make the orange a little bit paler at the top, and just painting that orange again towards the horizon and the top of those trees. If you noticed, I'm actually painting over the watercolor pencil as well, and as you can see, it's disappearing. I've added a pinch of yellow now into the orange, and I'm painting that wet in wet just on the top left hand and right hand corners of the sky. I'm mixing up now some ultramarine and alizarin crimson to make a blue violet. I'm using my size 12 round brush, and I'm painting this wet in wet in the top right and left hand corners. Mixing up a little bit more of the same colour because I ran out there, so I'm using a smaller brush to mix and the larger brush to paint with, and painting sweeping marks across the top of the sky and a little bit to the right in the middle there. And that's a little bit more damp into wet because there's not very much paint on my brush. I'm mixing up a darker wash of both of those colours, still using the ultramarine and the alizarin crimson, slightly thicker, slightly darker, and painting this damp into wet, so the surface is still wet but my brush isn't too wet, and that ensures that the paint doesn't run too much so those clouds stay put, but you get lovely soft edges. So I'm adding a little bit more of a slightly creamier yellow and orange, painting this damp into wet in the middle of the sky, and now I'm lifting out the sun with my paper towel. And now I'm blending a little bit with a clean damp brush just to make the edge of the sun look a little bit more natural. Again, I'm mixing up the ultramarine and the alizarin crimson, slightly darker, damper paint. That means it's not too wet, painting on the wet surface at the top of the sky and around the left and the right edges, damp into damp, making some smaller marks as it goes towards the horizon to create depth in my painting. So darker, bigger marks at the top, smaller, paler marks at the bottom. So as you saw there, I added some more ultramarine with a touch of the alizarin crimson this time. So it's more of a blue, violet, darker colour, and just painting that damp into damp at the top of the sky, and a little bit to the right here, damp into damp, using the tip of my brush, adding a touch more dark to the left, really creating some interest in the sky. Rinsing my brush now, taking the excess water off and just blending some of those darks there, paling them as they go towards the horizon. So mixing up a little bit more of that Pyrrole orange now, adding some water. I'm just going to paint that damp into damp just beneath that violet there, bringing it down onto the sort of top of the trees to create some warmth on the horizon. Adding some yellow as well, blending as I paint. Adding some yellow now, painting wet into wet, the sort of reflection in the water here, using my size 12 brush, adding some of the Pyrrole orange now, painting this wet into wet, so you've got some lovely orange and yellow reflection of the sky in the water here as well. So you may be surprised that the paper is still wet from my wetting the back of it earlier, and then a few minutes after wetting the front, after painting the sky area, the water area here remains wet. So that's why it's such a great idea about using glass or Perspex, wetting the back of your painting. It just gives you more time. So I'm painting damp into wet now, using that violet colour and painting some darks in the water, reflection of those dark clouds there. So this is a little bit more damp into wet. I don't want this to run too much, so the violet isn't as watery as the yellow and orange were. And I'm trying to keep lots of light in the middle there, where it's sort of reflecting the sun in the sky. And I'm using my size 12 brush to paint some of the darks right on the edge of the snow and the water, and it really does make that sort of white stand out of the snow area as well. So this is damp into wet, or even damp into damp, and I'm just sort of using the tip of my brush to add a few more dark reflections here and there. There was a little mark there on the sun, so I'm just lifting off with a clean damp brush, also using my paper towel to make sure that no excess water creeps into the sky, because sometimes that can create a cauliflower or back run. And I've actually, as you saw there, lifted out the sun in the water as well to reflect the sun in the sky. Adding some orange now, damp into wet, with my size 8 brush, just to create some interest, and also the reflection of the sky as well. Painting around the sun area really brings the reflection of the sun out of the water, and I'm just lifting off some of that light as well with my paper towel. Light is so important in watercolour painting, so you've always got to be mindful of it. So sometimes if you think you're losing it, just lift off with a clean damp brush or a paper towel. Adding some more orange, damp into damp in the sky there, using my size 8 round brush just to add some more warmth. There really draws your eye into the sky, and then again painting this damp into damp in the water. So it's not too wet now, the water, but there is a sheen on the paper, and it allows me to paint comfortably without the painting drying out. So I'm mixing up some Paynes grey and alizarin crimson here. It makes the most beautiful, interesting dark, and using my size 12 round brush, I'm painting pretty much damp into damp here, some of the darks in the water. So as you can see, I'm working light to dark now, so I'm starting to think about my darks in the water, especially right at the water's edge. You get that lovely contrast between the white of the snow and the dark reflections in the water. Try to keep your reflections horizontal. I almost kind of had mine leaning a little bit. It can easily happen, so try to keep them as straight as possible. I'm mixing up some ultramarine with a pinch of that that Paynes grey and alizarin crimson, and painting this very, very dilute wash now, wet into wet on the snow area to create some sort of colour in the snow. It's not completely white, and I've added a very watered down alizarin crimson and Paynes grey just in the corner in the foreground. Just blotting off as well some of that blue there to create some light and white of the snow as well. I'm mixing up here some burnt sienna and the Pyrrole orange. I'm painting damp into damp with my size 12 brush. You can see it's bleeding there into the sky very gently, so it's not too wet. So make sure your paint is creamy and not wet. But you can see the paper is allowing me to do this. It's still damp enough, and it creates some lovely sort of soft edges there. And I've mixed up now the alizarin with the Paynes grey and just painting that at the bottom of the trees, damp into damp with my size 12 brush. And just sort of creating those darks just here and there, adding a little bit more creamier dark now. I've added a touch more Paynes grey. So you've really got these sort of light, medium and dark tonal values. And I've swapped to a sword liner brush. You could use a rigger even, and just using the belly of the brush to create some dry brush effects. As you can see there, you can still get a dry brush effect even when you're working on damp paper. And the trick is to have not much paint on your brush and use the belly of the brush. Do practice this technique. It's really so much fun to do to create texture even on a damp surface. So I'm using that here, as you can see, the side and the belly of my brush to create some textured marks here and there. It's so effective, so I'm using that same technique, the belly of the brush on the edge of the water here, the riverbank, and just sort of creating textures. So you've got some sort of grasses coming through the snow there, using the tip of my brush as well to paint some thinner grasses, but just varying my marks here, working damp into damp. Mixing up some Pyrrole orange now with a little bit of that Paynes grey, just to add a bit of warmth in those grasses and some colour harmony as well. And just varying again the grasses. You can see it's quite damp here in the foreground, so I'm using some of that orange, a little bit of that Paynes grey, and I am using my size 8 round brush, just varying those marks. It's all pretty much damp into wet. So I really want to bring out the snow in the foreground there, so I'm actually painting some more dark in the water, pretty much damp into damp. And I am using the burnt sienna with some Paynes grey and trying to keep those marks, reflections, horizontal as I paint these marks. Adding a few more darks in the foreground here, using my size 6 round brush, and I'm also painting some tree trunk and branches in the distance here, damp into damp, using the Paynes grey mixed with the burnt sienna, so it's quite a creamy mix. I am using tube paint, which I do find easier for this technique. If you are using pans, you may want to give them a spray half an hour before you use them. It'll soften up the paint, making it easier to make creamier washes. So I'm really adding lots of tree trunks and branches in there and a few more darks there on the water's edge using the tip of my brush, using some of that Pyrrole orange now and adding some orange in the water. I felt it wasn't sort of warm enough to reflect the sky, so just adding a few more orangey marks as well in the foreground and in the sort of middle ground on that lovely blanket of snow, just to create some interest but also create some colour harmony as well. These sort of marks to reflect the sort of distant trees and the sky, just adding some darks here and there just to really create interest and texture. So I'm using a plastic card. It's just a store card cut up, and it's great when the paint is damp because it lifts off, as you can see, beautifully, especially in these distant trees. It looks like lighter tree trunks and branches, but it also creates light and detail in the sort of distant trees here, brings them to life. As the water is still damp, I'm just lifting off some of the reflections of those light tree trunks in the water as well, using my plastic card. Try to make sure that you do it directly underneath the tree if you can, but I'm only just putting a few in. I'm also lifting off or swiping off with the card some of the light reflections in the water as well. This works so well when the paper is damp. If it's wet, it will all run back in on each other. So make sure that there's a sheen on your paper, but that it is damp. You can sort of try this out by just experimenting. So if it does run back in, just wait a few more minutes and have another go. So I'm adding some Paynes grey now directly, literally from the tube, and using the belly of my brush to paint the dark just at the bottom of the trees there. So you've really got some contrast of dark and light, especially on the top of the snow area. So really sort of creating that dry brush effect again, because there's no moisture on my brush and I'm using the belly of the brush. I've added a little bit of burnt sienna to that colour as well, just to warm things up, creating more texture and darks to these distant trees. Adding a little bit more dark in the foreground as well for contrast against the white of the snow here, painting literally almost dry brush effect here, and I am just sort of painting a few more reflections in the water, some of the trees there as well, some downward reflections, using my size 4 round brush with a mixture of the Paynes grey and the burnt sienna, and just working again with the belly of the brush. I'm just making lots of downward marks here to create details in the water, adding a few more grasses on the edge of the riverbank there to create the contrast with the snow as well, painting a few in the foreground, just varying my marks, varying my darks as well, using my size 4 round brush, painting damp into damp. I'm actually spattering some of that Paynes grey and burnt sienna mix just here and there to create some textures and details. Now the paint's a little bit wetter onto the damp surface, but I'm willing to take the risk. You must sort of mask out your sky. Because the sky is still damp, I don't want to put a paper towel on there, so I'm just using my hand. So you may want to wait till your painting is dry to do this. I couldn't resist using my card again to pull out some more light in those trees, so it just shows that that paint is still damp. So just pulling out here and there a few more lighter trees and trying to make some bigger marks here and there as well. I'm using my size 4 round brush. I'm painting damp into damp some of the sort of darker tree trunks and branches, using the burnt sienna and the Paynes grey, just to add a few more darks and details here and there in those distant trees. I'm going to add a little bit more dry brush effect here using the belly of my brush. As you saw there, I took off all the excess liquid and moisture on the paper towel, so it really enables me to create this lovely dry brush effect with the belly of the brush, even on damp paper. I felt I lost my light in the foreground water here. What's great about this damp paper is I can actually spritz off all of that paint there to get rid of the dark, to get the light back. So that's another really good advantage of painting on damp paper. It allows you to do this without the danger of creating backruns and things like that. So I'm just lifting off all of the excess paint, cleaning up here, making sure that there's no moisture creeping back into my painting. And I am replacing that lifted off or spritzed off paint with some of the cadmium yellow with the Pyrrole orange, painting damp into damp there, just varying the colours, keeping the light of the underpainting and then adding that sort of warm yellow with the Pyrrole orange there, and then lifting off a little bit with my paper towel to make sure that I've got the reflection of the sun. So I'm just lifting off there carefully, adding a little bit more of that cadmium yellow pale, painting damp into damp to create some lovely yellow light reflections in the water, and then adding some orange accents here and there. Rinse my brush using a clean damp brush. I'm just going to soften that there and blend it into the yellow just to make it look a little bit more natural, and blending with a little bit more of yellow on my brush as well. I felt I overworked that, so I've just lifted off with my paper towel, and again going back in with a touch of orange here and there, and then blending with a clean damp brush. And I'm actually lifting off with the paper towel the sun as well, as the paint sort of creeps back in, and also the reflection of the sun going through the water. Just lifting off with the paper towel is really effective. If you feel you've lost your light, you can use some white gouache. I'm using it straight from the tube, as you can see, because there's enough moisture on that paper. Using my size 4 round brush, painting damp into damp, some highlights in the water, varying the marks, keeping them horizontal and sort of leading your eye into the painting. And I'm just painting a few more lights here and there, to the right, to the left, little sparkly highlights here and there to create interest and to give the illusion of water. I couldn't resist spattering some of that white there. So again, I'm spattering onto the damp surface with my size 4 round brush to create a little bit of light texture and sparkle. I'm just lifting off some of the spatters there that I felt didn't work, so it does come off quite nicely. And then just adding a few more lights there in the foreground, softening them with the paper towel to finish my painting. And here is the finished painting. It's still a little bit damp, but I'm using a mount board here and I'm going to cut it in half, so you've got 2 L shapes. You can see that, and it just sort of frames the painting really nicely. And I can just see if I need to do any more to finish it, but I think I'll leave it there for now. I'm really pleased with it. So I really hope this tutorial has been helpful, especially if you are one of those watercolor painters that finds your paintings dry too quickly. Try it out. You may really be happy with the results and feel more comfortable painting in watercolor. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, where you'll get updates of my latest tutorials. And if you want to get access to my weekly exclusive tutorials, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about the membership can be found in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.